Early in our conversation, you mentioned the fact that muscle is this endocrine organ, which before preparing for this interview and diving into your work, I hadn't heard somebody talk about it that way. So I want to talk about this aspect of muscle and the myokines and how that all
Yeah,
works.
so cool. Yeah. This was actually pioneered by a woman named Dr. I think her first name is, it's like Bente Pedersen. And she is in Copenhagen, and she is she is a physician. And she studies exercise immunology. And her work was really, and still is very pivotal, And it's we don't hear about it so much in the US, but basically it looked at skeletal muscle as this endocrine organ. And there was this exercise factor. When you contract skeletal muscle, and the majority of the research is done in cardiovascular activity, that skeletal muscle secretes these myokines. Myokines are proteins much like cytokines, right? So the inflammatory cytokines that say are released from macrophages. And what's so interesting is they have a pleiotropic effect, meaning when they're released from skeletal muscle, they act differently in the body. They actually counterbalance inflammation in the body. So it increases this interleukin 6, which we always talk about as being inflammatory, like the cytokine storm, but actually exercising muscle can increase over 100-fold more of these myokines, which there's hundreds of different myokines, but let's say interleukin 6 or interleukin 10. And it's this exercise factor that affects the immune system. So, essentially lowering systemic inflammation, balancing other inflammatory cytokines like TNF alpha, also relates to nutrient partitioning. And why is this important, and what is nutrient partitioning? Nutrient partitioning is the way in which we utilize our macronutrients, the way in which we utilize carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And oftentimes when we think about exercise, we just think about calorie utilization. But there's another interesting component to exercise, that there's an interplay between this interleukin 6 and these myokines that are released from muscle that say make liver more sensitive or make adipose tissue more sensitive. So essentially what I'm saying is there's an exercise factor above and beyond calories in, calories out. Like it's a very complex interplay, a crosstalk between liver, adipose tissue, and skeletal muscle that really originates from this exercising muscle. And that is, the definition of an endocrine organ. It has both local and systemic effects. And it's just very fascinating. So this is one way in which skeletal muscle is an endocrine organ.
I'm excited to introduce you to Organifi Red Juice. This caffeine-free drink will give you an energy boost. It contains powerful adaptogens, made with real berries, and it's sweetened with monk fruit. Click the link in the description to save 20%. And now back to the show. So when it comes to this endocrine piece, how long does that effect last after somebody does a workout? And is it something we want to be triggered all the time? Do we want to hit that on a regular basis, or do we want periods of time where we don't have that effect in the body?
This is a very astute question, and obviously because you've been interviewing for a very long time. There are immediate effects that happen with exercise. The immediate effects are some of the things that I'd mentioned, that increase in interleukin, so the increase in those myokines, and then also changes in, say, HDL and triglycerides. They're acute effects. Is that where the magic is? I would argue and say it's not, quite frankly. The magic isn't in the acute effect. It's in the multiple chronic stimulation of these things. So what do we know when we chronically stimulate this exercise piece? Well, we see actually lower levels of these inflammatory cytokines just across the board. And you would think that they would be higher. They're actually lower. We also see white blood cells in a more desirable range, which is also interesting. There was a study, the study was okay. It was called the Drew study, but it looked at some of this, and it was interesting. And so there's a potential that the white blood cells are also a bit on the lower end. And when I say lower, I would say in a more ideal range. So that becomes very interesting. But again, your question is very astute. What is the dose needed? And I think that is evolving. I think that the way in which we can look at that is that we look at the dose in terms of what is ideal for the human and what are the markers that we can measure. And we can measure strength, and we can measure body composition, and we can measure surrogate markers of muscle health like insulin resistance and glucose, or insulin, glucose, triglycerides, HDLs, HSCRP. But again, I think exercise physiology is a little bit of the Wild West as it relates to what would that specific input be. I say that, nevertheless, I think that there are particular recommendations that would be beneficial for nearly everybody. And that is, number one, focus on strength first. And that could be 3 to 4 days of training, but really there should be, and there's multiple ways to get an adaptation, right? And you can talk to some of my colleagues who are specialists in exercise physiology, and they would tell you a million different ways of a well-designed program. But, from a medical perspective, focusing on strength, thinking about how do we leverage strength, because that's very valuable. Strength doesn't mean you're necessarily going to grow bigger muscles. It can, your muscles will grow. But once you've established a baseline strength, I do think also layering on hypertrophy. And, some of my colleagues would also disagree with me when I talk about hypertrophy and what its relevance is. But hypertrophy is simply the way in which you make the muscle bigger. Initially, when we started this interview, you said, okay, well, what's the role of skeletal muscle and why do we care about it, if everyone's focused on obesity? And I said, well, skeletal muscle is the primary site for glucose disposal. How do we increase our capacity to have glucose disposal?
Put on more muscle?
You increase it through muscle. You have more muscle. You still have to train it to keep it, but the reality is you have more muscle, right? And again, Don Layman, my mentor of 20 years, we go back and forth because he said, well, it's not just the amount of muscle, that the data doesn't support that. But I would say, I think one of the reasons that we haven't done a good job about understanding the relationship of skeletal muscle and overall health is because we haven't had a great way of testing it and measuring it in a way that is clinically relevant and reproducible. We're starting to. There's going to be a way in which, I think this is out of Evan Williams' lab, or maybe it's William Evans. It's William Evans, Dr. Evans, talking about creatine. Like you can take a pill in which it labels creatine, and then you can measure creatinine as a way of measuring skeletal muscle, and that may track with an MRI. But anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying, skeletal muscle, what are is this acute or chronic? And I would say the changes are acute. We need chronic activity, and there's multiple ways of doing that.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
People say they don't have time. And the reality is, if you don't have time for fitness, then how do you think you're going to have time for sickness? I think that we have a muscle crisis, not an obesity crisis. And that's why I do what I do. I do what I do because if you have a capacity